Hello and welcome to Dice Encounters, and in the second part of this video series we're talking to the players who want to be in the 41st millennium, yeah, lucky ducks. So you've signed up to be in a game of Wrath and Glory. Hope you're looking forward to it. I'm going to give you some tips that are going to hopefully help you have a good time, and also some stuff that I feel like that I wish that I knew going in, and my players as well. I'm playing a GM and a player, so I'm kind of getting both sides of it. And I think a player going into a specific game like this, there's some things that you need to know. The first thing you should think about is, do you have a clue about Warhammer 40k? If you do, that's great. If you don't, you might have a little bit of trouble. First thing I would do is talk to your GM and say, I don't know much about it, can you keep it simple? There's a lot of complicated stuff, a lot of factions where there's a lot of weird nuance. You know, if you're playing D&D, you know where you stand with orcs, you know where you stand with wizards, you know where you stand with dragons, but in 40k there's some really weird shit in there, and if you don't know how to act or react, or how they act and react, it's going to be confusing, it's not going to be very fun, and what's worse, the 40k sort of veterans will just be like hee 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 at you and your stupidity. So if you don't know anything about 40k, that's no problem. Hopefully you've spoken to your GM and they're sort of making a mission that's not going to be throwing any weird stuff, that you can sort of relatively get on board with. But if you want to do a bit of homework, that's totally fine. The easiest thing you can do is you can go on to Lexicanum or the 40k Wikipedia and just read about stuff that just go down a hole and just read stuff about Warhammer. The rulebook itself is fantastic for giving you information on all the different factions that you can be involved in, the archetypes within those factions, the kind of the system that you're in. So that's definitely a go-to as well. If there's a specific faction that you like, you can always go out and buy one of the codexes for the tabletop game. That normally is chock-a-block full of all the information that you would ever need to know about that faction. And also, if you have the ability and the patience, I recommend picking up some 40k audiobooks. Even if you already do know about 40k, I would recommend listening to 40k audiobooks, especially if you want to be role-playing in a 40k game. The reason being is because they add in a lot more of the grimdark, the drama, the edginess, the grossness. All that stuff can really come in, and one of the best things about playing Wrath and Glory is getting to ham it up with your friends, doing the very serious British voices for the Space Marines, or maybe the gross, nurgly voices. So now you're starting to look into character creation. Hopefully you've all picked a framework which to sort of start with. This will impact which characters that you will make. You know, talk to your GM about that. What kind of archetypes and factions would best fit for the framework. And when going through the archetypes, do look at which ones you find cool. You know, do you want to be a frontline warrior like a crusader, or do you want to be more of an intelligent character like an inquisitorial sage? Do you want to be like a mechanic like a tech priest? Do you just want to be a straight up fighter like a mercenary or a space marine? You know, whatever you want to be. But I would also make sure that you read about the organization that they're in just as much as you read about the archetype, because if you want to play a frontline warrior character but you don't really know much about the cult mechanicus, then your GM should be able to suggest to you a way to make that character, but in a faction that is a bit more easy to understand and easy to get on with. You know, you can be pretty much a human of any description in the game, luckily. It's not tied to a specific faction that has a lot of strict dogma and rules. I also mentioned this in my GM video, but you really want to have a talk about the way the different stats work. You know, stuff like the fact that defense is actually always going to be pretty low, and defense can be improved by stuff like being in cover and being hard to see and being in difficult terrain. That kind of stuff comes with the way that you play the game, whereas your resilience and your toughness is stuff which is included with your stats, with your war gear. So if you want to be tanky, make sure that you focus on the right stats. Make sure that you look at the stats like your resolve and your determination. Know where your weaknesses are. If you have a low resolve, you're going to be terrible when you come across anything scary. So you need to know that's going to be the case. Also, when making a character, I suggest taking a look at the talents. When you've selected your archetype, they should have a list of suggested talents as well. I would go and check those out, because there's a lot of talents where to get them, you need to have invested a lot in a specific skill. But those talents are super powerful, and you can build a character completely around that talent. And if you're a min-maxing kind of person, the talents are definitely where it's at. There's also some really good utility stuff in there. If you're struggling with social encounters, if you feel like after a few sessions there's something that you really want to be good at, the good news is you can just start spending XP in that immediately. You don't have to change class or anything. But speaking of changing class, this is actually one of my favourite tips for playing role-playing games. So you can take this with you to any game, even if you're not playing Wrath and Glory. And that tip is, have a view on your character development. Think about, every now and again, check in with your character idea, and you'll have the idea from the beginning, your concept, the character as they start playing the game. But you should be thinking about where that character is going. If your character is a dickhead, maybe you should be thinking about ways that they stop being a dickhead. Just to make your fellow players not want to punch you. My character that I'm playing, for instance, is a bit of a coward. No, they're actually quite a big coward. They don't like fighting. They don't like putting themselves in harm's way unnecessarily, which is actually very understandable in the 41st millennium. But it's not how you would want to play a role-playing game forever. So using the part of their story, which is them being part of the Inquisition, they are being exposed to these situations they can't control, these combat scenarios, being in the trenches with the guardsmen as the orcs are charging towards them, and slowly but surely they're developing a bit of courage. It might be sort of practical courage, where they still don't want to go into a situation where the odds are against them. They don't want to go head first into any situation that seems dangerous. But that's kind of what I felt like the character needed, and what seemed natural at the time, of them being put into all these dangerous situations and being part of the Inquisition, where the Inquisition is saying, we're training you up to take on fucking heretics and demons. You need to get your shit together if you want to ever be an Inquisitor yourself. And when you're looking at developing your character, you can also look in your organization, and you can look at other archetypes as well. And you can say, Inquisition's quite easy because you go from Acolyte or Sage to Interrogator to Inquisitor. It's quite linear. But if you're a Tech Priest, for example, you can become an Infiltrator or a Ruststalk, or you can become a Tech Priest Dominus. There's different ways that your character can kind of split off, or they can just stay the way that they are, and then they can take an Ascension package which changes them in a different way. Maybe they have to change faction, or maybe they get loads of augmented parts to them, which changes them completely. It's not something that you have to think about all the time. What I like to do when I make a character is have a little bit of a rough guide as to where I would like the character to go, and then based on stuff that happens in the campaign, I can change it or tilt it, or if something really crazy happens, then that can be a big impact that completely turns them the other way, like a near-death experience or something like that. Another thing you want to think about as a player in Wrath and Glory is you want to think about how your character relates to your patron or your framework. Is your character someone who really doesn't get on with their patron, or is you someone who wants to worship your patron? You think they're great. I understand the desire to be an edgelord and really hate the person, the hand that feeds you. Fine. Maybe consider flipping it and being a sycophant every once in a while. That can also be quite fun to play. If you want to play a framework where you're all tech priests, maybe you have the ones who they worship the patron because they're nearly all machine, and you have the Ruststalkers who are just feel like they're enslaved, and they just feel like they want to just go out and kill stuff, but don't start a campaign where you're already locked into a natural antagonism with the NPCs around you. If you're playing an orc, if you've been able to play a Xenos, you want to make sure, ask your GM, are the people who I'm going to interact with during the game, how are they? Is everyone just going to hate me and want to kill me on the site? Is that going to be how it is? Is there going to be a way that I'm going to get a break from that, and I can actually explore what it's like to play as an orc in the 41st millennium? And that's about all my proper tips. I have one last hot tip for you, and that is use your glory. Use your glory. Don't forget about the glory. You have two resources as players. You have Wrath and you have Glory. Wrath is really good because you can reroll everything. Glory is not as good because it's just adding dice, but you get a lot of it and you get all the time it refills. So make sure you tell your players to use the Glory and they can seize the initiative. That's really good. Oh, and my final tip is, I already said this in my GM video, but have a frank discussion about how you want to treat death. Do you want death to be as likely as the rules as written make it, or do you want to actually play a character for most of the campaign and only get killed if you really mess up and do really badly? As a GM, I always like to think that there are more things more interesting than players dying. They can always come back as indebted to another faction. They can be, locked into a power armor suit and in lots of pain. There's so many grim, dark ways that players can avoid death. As I've made a video before, failure, you should fail forwards and you should fail upwards, and that's what makes role-playing games interesting. And that's it for my video for the players. If you want to find out more information about Wrath and Glory, you want to get some more tips, I heartily recommend that you go to the Wrath and Glory Discord server. There's people in there who know everything about the 40k lore. They know everything about the game mechanics. They'll help you make up new mechanics if you want to do some game design yourself, and they'll help you make cool characters and answer all your questions and everything. It's quite invaluable. So that's it. I will see you in my next video. Until then.